Lord of Mysteries. My Identities echoes across time chapter 51 to 60. In the midst of this chaos, a uniqueness in the Beander characteristics suddenly seemed to be thrown towards Antigonus. Antigonus instinctively caught them, and saw Amonizes looking towards him with a hint of emotion. His fur almost exploded at that moment. Without needing to think, Antigonus turned and ran into the gaps of historical void. He wanted to escape, to leave this place that filled him with fear. Wow, you run so fast. I was actually going to try to stop you. And not far from the gods' war, two heads popped out from behind the trunk of a towering tree, one gold and one red, Lynn and Medici, who had rushed over to watch the show. They witnessed the double betrayal scene almost as soon as they arrived, and now they were peering curiously at everything happening in the distance. The battle on Amonizes' side undoubtedly came to an end, while on the other side, under the gaze of the two youngsters, the surge of acidic blood started to slow down. In just a few seconds, all the blood fully receded, revealing surroundings that were completely decimated and releasing acidic steam. In the middle, only the figure of the Twilight Giant could be seen. The goddess of the moon, Lilith, and the mutated King Kvastir disappeared at that moment. However, the expression of the Twilight Giant was not very good. It seemed he was holding something in his hand, probably the uniqueness or the Beander characteristics. But Lynn could tell that the giant King Ormir didn't seem particularly satisfied with his gains, but he wasn't completely dissatisfied either. As if sensing Lynn's gaze, the giant King Ormir suddenly looked towards Lynn and Medici's direction with indescribable aura. Apparently this action carried a bit of venting and resentment towards Lynn and Medici. But just before this almost substantial aura reached Lynn and Medici, deep darkness and imperceptible shadows appeared simultaneously, completely dissolving this aura. It's just my two curious children, Ormir, no need to threaten them. Sosrier appeared silently in front of Lynn and Medici, smiling, but his attitude was unquestionable. Amonizes appeared next to the two youngsters at some point. She didn't say anything, just calmly looked at the giant King Ormir in the distance. Even though she didn't say anything, it was as if she had said everything. HMPH, take care of your brats. If you peek again next time, it won't be so simple. Giant King Ormir snorted coldly and looked at Amonizes again. The latter looked back calmly. Amonizes knew that Ormir must be full of killing intent towards her at this moment. This killing intent was not because of her recent actions, but because Amonizes had taken the biggest advantage in this battle. As a Twilight Giant mainly on the path of Twilight, even if it was instinctual, Ormir would want to devour her completely. It was just that Ormir still cared about Sosrier present, so he didn't make a move. This was also the reason why Amonizes had just made a move to block Ormir's attack. She did have a good impression of Sosrier, but the main reason for her action was to show an attitude towards Sosrier, and to inform Ormir that she and Sosrier are on the same front. HMPH. Finally, Ormir snorted and didn't say anything more, turning around and leaving the battlefield directly. After he left, Amonizes withdrew her gaze and looked at Sosrier, saying, "When I officially ascend to darkness, I will visit him. The divine realm is always welcome to your arrival." Sosrier smiled and said, with an attitude that couldn't be faulted. So Amonizes melted into the endless darkness. Seeing that outsiders had finally left, Sosrier looked at Lynn and Medici. His expression was somewhat helpless, but not surprising. He just sighed and said, "I remember, you promised me you wouldn't get too close." Although there was no sign of anger, it made people feel guilty for no reason. If I say my feet walked by themselves, would you believe me?" Lynn immediately smiled awkwardly, his eyes wandering around, avoiding looking directly at Sosrier. Actually, Lynn knew that he did indeed get a little too close. But there was nothing he could do. After all, he wanted to see more clearly. Being too far away would only allow him to see vague images, and he wouldn't be able to see the specific situation at all. Ads by PubFuture. Compared to Lynn's guilty plea, Medici simply lowered his head and remained silent. The hunter who had always been provocative was no longer provoked at this moment. After all, Medici was not stupid. He knew that if he said something provocative at this time, he would surely attract all the resentment to himself, and in the end, he would definitely be beaten up, while Lynn, he might not even be scolded. Medici understood his elder brother too well. "What do you think?" Saussure looked at Lynn, calmly asking. "Sorry, I was wrong. I shouldn't have gotten so close, and I shouldn't have openly looked at the giant King Ormir." Lynn immediately apologized, clasping his hands above his head and bending his waist, emphasizing his pitiful and sincere attitude. "Anyway, he's just a kid now. It's not embarrassing no matter what he does. Lynn has always been good at playing to his strengths. Now that you know you were wrong, will you dare to do it again next time?" Saussure was surprised by his quick apology, then raised a hand to gently rub his temples, seeming to have a headache. "I won't dare anymore, really," Lynn immediately promised, showing a very good attitude of apology. At the same time, he didn't forget to shift the blame onto Ormir. After apologizing, he whispered plaintively, "I didn't expect Ormir to be so petty. I just glanced at him, and he wanted to kill me. Ormir is indeed a bit unreasonable." Saussure also recalled the scene just now, his expression becoming much colder. Lynn, on the other hand, showcased his acting skills, trying hard to make himself look even more innocent and pitiful. Dissing on the side, he muttered, "Yeah, exactly." Hearing the fire-stoking voice, Saussure glanced at Lynn. The latter immediately closed his mouth in understanding, but his pitiful expression remained unchanged. This left Saussure unsure of where to start. If Lynn's attitude towards apologizing hadn't been so positive, Saussure would have properly educated him, but since the other party showed such obedience, even though Saussure knew that this obedience was just a superficial appearance, in the end, he could only sigh, reach out and rub Lynn's head a few times, and say, "Remember this lesson, don't make the same mistake next time." "I will," Lynn immediately promised, but as for the degree of certainty in this, only he himself knew. Saussure then turned to the Medici, who had been playing dead beside him, and said, "You too, Medici, don't always let your brother mess around. When it's time to stop him, you should stop him." I got it." Medici rolled his eyes, not arguing, "How could I possibly stop him? You're obviously biased towards him." Because Medici understood that, yes, Saussure really was biased. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Too bad Little Red didn't provoke Saussure. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to deal with this. This kid is so clever at crucial moments. Where did his provocative spirit go? Lynn muttered to himself as he regained consciousness in the fifth epic, feeling somewhat regretful. It was a perfect display of his brotherly love towards his younger brother. If Medici knew, they'd probably end up fighting again. Looking around, Lynn noticed he had been moved from the floor to the sofa. On the opposite sofa, Klein and Leonard were quietly exchanging words. "You're awake." The two naturally noticed Lynn's movement and stopped their conversation, turning their attention to him. Lynn responded, sitting up on the sofa. He unabashedly glanced towards where Master Rosago's body should have been, only to find it gone, with even the bloodstains cleaned up. "We've cleaned up the scene while you were unconscious. Don't worry, we're professionals and left no traces," Leonard explained promptly, seeing Lynn's gaze. In a sense, what he said was true. After Rosago was dealt with and Lynn fell unconscious due to spiritual exhaustion, the two Nighthawks reported the situation to the church. Of course, being individuals with secrets, Leonard and Klein tacitly concealed some details from each other. For example, Klein's creeping hunger, and Leonard's ability to hold his own using his spirituality, despite being Sequence 7. Upon receiving the report, the church was equally shocked. They hadn't expected Rosago to attempt to silence Lynn Sotos before leaving. After a brief meeting, the church decided on the following actions. The church would take full responsibility for dealing with Bakarland and the remnants of the Intis spy faction. They wouldn't give Bakarland any more chances. Rosago's body was taken away by the Nighthawks team that came to clean up the scene. However, the church didn't ask the two to hand over items like the marionettist characteristics of Rosago. On one hand, these items didn't entirely belong to Klein and Leonard. On the other hand, according to the church, since the two were currently on a secret mission and considering the need to maintain their hidden identities and potential unforeseen circumstances during the mission, the items obtained by them during the mission would be handled by them. In return, the church wouldn't give them any credit for turning in items. This was quite normal, as the church wasn't in the habit of having the Nighthawks hand over the spoils of their missions for free. In fact, the contributions made by each Nighthawk and the items handed over were converted into corresponding merits by the church. Nighthawks could use these merits to exchange for things they wanted, such as promotion elixirs. The church was indeed generous to its own people. This reaction means that the people from the church have already been here. Lynn immediately speculated inwardly. Then, he turned to Klein and saw him laying out a pile of things on the table. Among them were a colorful item that looked like an eye inside an iron box, several pounds of cash, some essential oils and herbal powders, and a strange piece of paper. The paper was orange, with a blank rectangle enclosed by symbols corresponding to the sun and mystic signs. Just holding it made one feel warm and secure. This is Rosago's Beander characteristics, corresponding to the main characteristics of the Sequence 5 potion of the Seer pathway. Klein pointed to the colorful eye, and explained. After spending the past few days together, he knew Lynn Sotos's knowledge of mysticism was quite profound, so he was clear about what Beander characteristics were. Ads by PubFuture. Rosago. Lynn glanced at the colorful feature, showing a puzzled expression at the right time, though he wasn't surprised in the least. It seemed his speculation was correct. Even if Klein hadn't left the church, given the current level of attention the church was paying to him to some extent, and the consistent style of the church, Mr. World would still be born. Now that I've infiltrated the Tarot Club, I can witness the duet of the Fool and the World. Lynn thought, feeling pleased. Yeah, the person who came to kill you was Rosago, a Sequence 5 of the Seer pathway. He's probably the most powerful subordinate beside Ambassador Bakarland who wanted to kill you. Klein explained simply. Through divination, he not only knew the identity of the pursuer but also the subsequent Sequence 5 potion formula of the Seer pathway. This made Klein very happy, but also somewhat regretful. If only I had changed the marionettist's characteristics to something else earlier. Well, one shouldn't be too greedy. Klein muttered inwardly, then pointed to the strange piece of paper. This is the miraculous item corresponding to the notary. It temporarily enhances Beander abilities. If the notarization fails, the Beander abilities will be forcibly dispelled. As for these, they're just ordinary essential oils, herbal powders, and cash. Probably because they thought dealing with you would be easy, Rosago didn't carry much with him. Most of it is here. Klein explained, perhaps fearing Lynn would suspect them of pocketing items. These are our shared spoils. You choose first. Lynn nodded, completely trusting Klein's words, and then generously said with a smile. Besides wanting to replicate the original, Master Rosago's immortal legacy, he also hoped Mr. World would hurry up and establish himself, so naturally, he had to give little Klein a chance. Upon hearing this, Klein and Leonard exchanged glances, and without hesitation, Klein took away Rosago's Beander characteristics. Before Lynn woke up, they had already discussed that if Lynn didn't choose the marionettist's characteristics or let them choose first, it would belong to Klein. Of course, Klein would compensate Leonard to make up for his loss. Lynn wasn't surprised by this. He put away the remaining items, then casually tossed them behind him like catnip, and joked, the incident this time was too dangerous. That Bakarland ambassador is definitely a bastard. He's about to be sent back to his country, and he still sent his most capable subordinate to kill me. End of chapter. I also think that ambassador might have some problems with his brain, Leonard nodded in agreement. Or it might be that Lynn, you sending Ian to report to the Evernight Church really provoked him. Klein suggested with a laugh, but that Mr. Bakarland, he's probably more of a curly-haired baboon. No, even baboons might be smarter than him. PFF'd. Hearing the comparison to a curly-haired baboon, Lynn couldn't help but burst out laughing. Ha ha ha, curly-haired baboon. Then Lynn sat back down, poured himself a cup of tea, and said, but although this crisis has passed, my scrolls are used up. I'll have to make more. Hearing this, Klein and Leonard immediately recalled the previous battle, where Lynn's lavish use of scrolls stood out, making their expressions turn peculiar. As Nighthawks not particularly familiar with the Church of Steam's machinery hivemind, neither Klein nor Leonard had ever seen such an extravagant combat style before today. It was essentially throwing money at people. But this does align with the firepower coverage effect I've always wanted, it's just too extravagant. Klein muttered to himself. Leonard couldn't help but ask, "So, Lynn, you bought all those spiritual materials just to make scrolls?" "Yes, and it proved that my preparations were correct, didn't it?" Lynn smiled and nodded. "But, don't only at sequence 6 of the mystery prior pathway that Beyonders becomes a scrolls professor?" Leonard almost asked instinctively. The church had made mystery prior pathway information available to them while searching for the whereabouts of a suspected angel of that pathway. However, as soon as he spoke, Leonard realized something and hastily added, "Of course, if this involves your secret, just pretend I didn't ask." Then please allow me to keep it a secret." Lynn smiled and said, deliberately bringing up this topic. He took a sip of his tea and continued, "But if you need it, I can also make some scrolls for you. For the sake of our friendship, I'll only charge for materials, and I'll give you a 50% discount on the labor fee." In the name of friendship, shouldn't the labor fee be waived entirely? Klein joked, but felt a subtle interest. Though he couldn't afford to be as lavish as Lynn, Klein wouldn't mind having a few scrolls for self-defense, they might come in handy in critical moments. "I'd love to waive the fee, but I have to eat, you know." Lynn spread his hands in a helpless gesture. "I'm poor, remember." "So, what kinds of scrolls can you make?" Leonard asked curiously as he poured himself a cup of tea, not forgetting to fill Klein's cup as well. "For example, abilities from the spectator pathway like Dragonmight or soothing abilities, or some healing ones, like those from the apothecary pathway. I'm not very skilled at making scrolls that record offensive abilities, they're mostly auxiliary skills." Lynn rested his chin on one hand, explaining. Thanks to his recent adventures in the land of the demonic wolf, where he battled many crazed wolves and vampires, Lynn had expanded his skill library significantly. Though he hadn't gained many high-level skills, his collection of ordinary skills had grown substantially. Because he can only make auxiliary skill scrolls, he needs bodyguards. But Lynn really has a lot of secrets, no wonder the angel is watching him. Klein thought to himself and then said, "If possible, I'd like to order some healing scrolls." Being a seer and then a clown, both were quite fragile. For his own safety, Klein thought it was a good idea to have some healing scrolls on hand. "No problem, I'll write up a list of materials you'll need later. For the labor fee, since it's your first time, I'll give you an extra discount, just treat me to a meal." Lynn made an, "Okay," gesture at Klein. Thanks to Russell, this gesture's meaning had spread widely, much like various card games. Lynn wasn't really concerned about the labor fee. His main goal in offering to make scrolls was to strengthen his relationships with Klein and Leonard. Friends should have both emotional bonds and shared interests to be more stable. Then Lynn turned to Leonard and asked, "How about you, poet? Do you also want to order some healing scrolls like Sherlock?" While Lynn was pitching scrolls to the two Nighthawks, in a certain god kingdom filled with deep sleep flowers. The Evernight goddess knew she was dreaming. Ads by PubFuture. This was a rare occurrence for her. At her level, ordinary dreams were almost non-existent, especially since her domain included dreams, making them even rarer for her. But today, she indeed had a dream. The Evernight goddess dreamt of an incredibly distant past, long before she officially became Sequence 0. She dreamt of the plot that changed her fate, of her meeting with the Dark Angel Saucereer. However, unlike her memory, in this dream, Saucereer didn't come alone. He brought two infant mythical creatures. One of them was familiar to the Evernight goddess. It was Medici, who later became known as the Red Angel beside the ancient sun god. But the other child in the dream was blurred. The Evernight goddess couldn't clearly see his appearance or recall his name. Even though Saucereer introduced him in the dream, she still couldn't catch his name. Concealment. As a deity who held the authority over concealment, the Evernight goddess immediately realized that the child had been concealed. All his information was erased by some power, becoming unclear. Interesting. Thinking this, the Evernight goddess continued to observe the dream. She saw the child request to touch her head in her demonic wolf form and saw her past self agree to it. She saw the night when the land of the demonic wolf was destroyed, meeting the child again as he clumsily watched the battle of gods and almost got seriously injured by Almir. The dream ended abruptly there, and Ammonizes opened her eyes. A dream. No, this is my memory. Ammonizes sat up, the black skirt adorned with stars naturally falling. She covered her head with one hand, lost in thought. This isn't a false memory but the real past. End of chapter. This isn't a false memory, but a real past. Although it was incredible, Ammonizes quickly confirmed that the memory she had just regained was not a fabricated memory forced upon her by someone else, but a genuine part of her past that she had truly experienced. Has someone altered history? The fool. No, that's impossible. Even the fool cannot truly change a part of history. Ammonizes narrowed her eyes. She knew the key to the altered past lay with the child whose information had been erased, but she couldn't recall any details about him. Logically, Ammonizes should be highly wary of this unknown being, but in truth, despite her caution, she didn't have a bad feeling about the child in her memory. The memory is real, and so are the emotions. Ammonizes propped her head up with one hand. She realized her attitude was influenced by the memory, but she also knew the past that had been altered was genuinely experienced. She truly went through all of that, even though she had just now remembered it. Ammonizes decided not to deny these real experiences. However, Ammonizes' ultimate attitude would depend on what kind of person this unknown entity turned out to be and what his intentions were. If he had good intentions, Ammonizes wouldn't mind making a new friend. She already had enough enemies and didn't need to turn potential friends into foes. But if he had ill intentions, Ammonizes would not easily yield. Hopefully, it's not some outer deity. It shouldn't be. If an outer deity had the power to directly interfere with the past, they wouldn't still be trapped outside the barrier. Ammonizes thought, sighing suddenly as a look of nostalgia appeared in her eyes. If it's truly possible to change the past. Ammonizes closed her eyes. She didn't reject her current life. In fact, in many ways, she was living better than ever before. But she still missed the prosperous era, her past, her true homeland, and her family. If only, Ammonizes murmured, images of her parents' almost faded faces appearing in her mind, only to dissipate quickly. She opened her eyes, the nostalgia gone, replaced by a determined look. She wouldn't rely on an unknown entity to change anything. Even if such a miracle were possible in the future, Ammonizes would continue following her own plans, striving for a future for herself and the world. As she recalled that long-gone era, Ammonizes thought of someone who had recently entered her field of vision, someone who seemed to be an old acquaintance. Reason told her that these two things might not be related, but intuition suggested Ammonizes might find some clues through that person. Lynn naturally didn't know about the Evernight goddess dream. Even if he did, he wouldn't be too surprised, as this was something Lynn had anticipated long ago. He had even imagined the possible reactions of the deity when he patted the head of the black demonic wolf. Lynn's only possible confusion might be why, despite Pallas remembering the Angel of Secrets, and 008 having memories related to him, the Evernight goddess memories of him were in a state of concealment. Unfortunately, Lynn didn't know. So, unaware of all this, Lynn happily continued to manage his two identities. His secondary account followed Sasrir, helping to resettle the people of the land of the demonic wolf, experiencing the hardship of a corporate slave at a young age. Fortunately, he had a ready-made helper beside him, which eased his burden considerably. Meanwhile, his main body, after confirming Beckland was indeed being sent back, completed Klein's commission. After receiving the final payment, he moved back to 16 Minsk Street. In the dim room, the only light came from the flames in an iron basin. After confirming he wasn't being watched, Lynn hummed a little tune while tearing up the script he had written about the Lord of Storms event, throwing the pages into the fire one by one, watching them burn, turn yellow, and finally turn to ashes. Ads by PubFuture. This scene indeed gave Lynn the aura of a behind-the-scenes mastermind. After the entire script was burned, Lynn unhurriedly took out a small scroll, reciting an incantation as he used it on the ashes. This was a scroll from the darkness pathway, combined with Lynn's high position, possessing effects like anti-divination and anti-prophecy. After confirming that even if Klein tried to divine on the Saphira Castle, he likely wouldn't get any useful information, Lynn washed away the ashes with water. Then he took out his little notebook, playing with 008 while thinking about his next plan. The mission of his secondary account in the land of the demonic wolf was successfully completed. For the next period, Lynn mainly needed to help Saucereer resettle the people and take the opportunity to spread his faith, so he could stabilize his anchor point as soon as possible. If it weren't for Saucereer almost dying from overwork and my own need for believers, I wouldn't be suffering this corporate slave life. Lynn pouted, determined to avoid similar situations in the future. He also thought of Medici's recent plans. Because of having a corporate slave supervisor and a burdened older brother, Medici naturally didn't escape the fate of a corporate slave either. However, Medici, deserving of being the future Red Angel, handled numerous tasks without a single complaint. Medici even proposed to Saucereer that he wanted to find suitable candidates among these humans to train as members of his future legion. After all, a weather warlock without a legion was incomplete. Just as a sage needs to read enough knowledge and acquire enough information to become powerful, a weather warlock must have subordinates to fully exert their abilities. Saucereer was surprised but gladly agreed, even offering to help Medici if needed. Thus, Medici's daily tasks, in addition to his previous responsibilities, included selecting candidates for the Legion. As for training the selected members, that would wait until these people were properly settled. Honestly, the workload made Lynn's eyelids twitch. He was genuinely worried Medici might succumb to exhaustion before Saucereer. But this time, unlike before, Lynn didn't intend to dissuade Medici. After all, a Red Angel without his own legion wouldn't be complete. Having a legion and the faith of its members would be an absolute benefit to Medici, both in terms of strength and anchor points. End of the chapter. Ads by PubFuture. Speaking of which, from a role-playing perspective, perhaps I also need to establish a place similar to a school, teach some students, and play the role of a respected sage in the field of mysticism. Lynn pinched his chin, feeling that this was worth a try. After all, the hidden sage has been teaching everywhere. As a unique existence, there must be a reason for this behavior. Since Lynn currently doesn't have a clear direction for playing the sage, trying this out wouldn't be a bad idea. Anyway, having more schools and more people learning knowledge isn't a bad thing. But this is too much like being a corporate slave. Damn, does Saucereer have some strange aura? Lynn scratched his head. The Smurf account, which was originally sorting materials in the second epic, couldn't help but glance at Saucereer with deep resentment. Feeling the gaze, Saucereer asked, "What's wrong? If you're too tired, you can take a break. I'll handle the rest." Saucereer always seemed to be like this. Cold and ruthless to enemies but extremely gentle to his own people. This gentleness wasn't fake or merely polite. Lynn could confirm that Saucereer's warmth and care for him and Medici were genuine. He could also see that Saucereer's pity and concern for those suffering humans were real. This sometimes made Lynn wonder if Saucereer was really the so-called negative. But then again, being negative doesn't necessarily mean being bad. After all, there are people like Spider-Man. Given the character of the ancient sun god, it's not strange for his negative to be like this. While thinking this, Lynn didn't hesitate for a second. He put the materials on the table and smiled. "Then I'll trouble you, Saucereer." "Thank you very much." This action made Medici, who was also helping, pause and look at Lynn with a complicated expression, almost rolling his eyes. "Why are you looking at me like that? Did you find your brother particularly dazzling today?" Lynn smiled, though his words made Medici's fists clench. "It's another day of wanting to punch my brother. JPG. Medici, you should rest as well. There's not much work left today. Leave it all to me." Saucereer, seeing the undercurrents between the two little ones, spoke gently, trying to prevent another fight. "You said it." Medici put down the file, stood up, and looked at Lynn with disdain. "I'll go see if there are any good candidates among those signing up for the Legion today." His expression almost said that Lynn, who only thought about playing, was trash. "Funny, I also plan to select a group of suitable students for future teaching. After all, I am to become a sage. Lynn smiled and got up. As he passed Medici, he intentionally bumped his shoulder and said, "Join me, little brother." Medici. Saussure sighed as he watched the two fight again. You guys. Sigh. Saussure almost instinctively tried to mediate but then reconsidered, only sighing helplessly and continuing with the files. As usual, Lynn won their scuffle. Patting Medici's head, who was sitting on the ground, Lynn cheerfully said, "You have some improvements, but at this level you still can't beat me, little red." HMPH. Medici snorted, refusing to look at his annoying brother. So, keep trying, little red. I'm waiting for the day you surpass me. Lynn thought, standing up, dusting himself off, and heading to the temporary human settlement. Medici got up, brushed off the dust, and followed with a scowl. Saussure's gaze softened as he watched them leave. Although raising two kids made life hectic in many ways, compared to the lonely and monotonous past, Saussure didn't mind the liveliness. Ads by PubFuture. Being relied upon, cared for, and having help with work was new and pleasant for Saussure. Though sometimes, he wished the kids were a bit more obedient. Why are they both so mischievous? Though I can win now, given a hunter's advantage in close combat, one day Medici might actually beat me. Better to win more fights before that day comes. In the fifth epic, Lynn, dual surfing, selected students while reflecting. The more he fought Medici, the more he felt Medici's rapid progress in combat. It's no surprise. Hunters may not match warriors in melee, but they're still formidable, while Mysteries is a mage path. Even if Lynn could suppress Medici with experience now, as Medici digested his potion and mastered his abilities, surpassing Lynn in melee was inevitable. Such is the plight of a normal person before a cheat. Sigh. Lynn theatrically sighed, spinning 008, pondering his next move. First, he needed to quickly advance to Sequence 8. He had already bought one main material for Melee Scholar at Mr. A's gathering and had a lead on the other, which he would acquire tonight. As for auxiliary materials, Lynn had long prepared those. His next goal was clear: joining the Tarot Club. To join, I need to get the Fool's honorific name. Waiting for the Silver City incident takes too long. I should approach Furs and Zio. They should already have the name. Lynn pondered, pausing the quill in his hand. Worried about being targeted by an evil god, Zio might tell me the Fool's name, hoping I know something about mysterious beings. That sounds reasonable. End of chapter. After happily deciding on the next course of action, Lynn drafted a script with 008 and then enjoyed a refreshing nap to recharge for the evening's party hosted by Mr. A. Lynn first roughly disguised himself according to his current persona, then looked at himself in the mirror, doing some simple psychological conditioning. The reason for doing this wasn't anything else but because Lynn was about to meet Justice Audrey at Mr. A's party. Audrey was already a Sequence 8 telepathist, although she hadn't mastered true mind reading yet. She could easily judge others' emotions and even some thoughts through their expressions, body language, and more. Of course, with masks and cloaks, Audrey couldn't read Lynn's micro-expressions, but reading body language was still possible. So Lynn needed to psychologically prepare himself in advance to ensure he wouldn't expose too much information to Audrey, such as Lynn's deep understanding of her or his knowledge about the Fool, for example. As for other matters, Lynn didn't care. At times like these, I envy clowns. Perfectly controlling expressions and body language is just too good for the audience. Lynn couldn't help but comment. After finishing the psychological conditioning, he put on his mask and cloak. Just as he stepped out, he saw Klein from the opposite door, seemingly just returning home. His eyes lit up as he greeted him. "Hey, Sherlock, good evening." "Good evening, Lynn." Klein, who had just finished dealing with the investment in his bicycle, stood at his doorstep and heard a familiar voice, turning around to see Lynn. He smiled and greeted him back. At the same time, Klein also noticed Lynn's striking disguise and couldn't help but ask, "What's this? Are you going to a party or do you have a commission that requires a disguised identity? Do you remember the party we attended together last time, hosted by Mr. A? I'm going to that party. If all goes well, I might make a big profit." Lynn didn't have any intention of hiding. Rather, upon seeing Klein, he already had a plan to invite him along. After explaining tonight's plans, Lynn directly invited, "You want to come along? Actually, I feel a bit nervous going alone to sell the formula. If you can accompany me, I won't have to worry about any ill intentions there." Lynn wasn't worried that such a request would seem abrupt. After all, based on his personality displayed in front of Klein, it was normal to invite a friend to an extraordinary gathering or worry about danger. "Is this a commission?" Klein asked with a smile, teasingly, but had no intention of refusing. Although Klein wouldn't deliberately do such a thing, if he really encountered such an opportunity in the real world, he had no reason to refuse. "And I can also take this opportunity to observe those two ladies. If they're suitable, maybe I can really bring them into the Tarot Club." Klein supplemented in his heart. "If it's a commission, then is the fee, how about a late-night snack?" Lynn asked with a half-joking, half-serious tone. "Sure." Klein nodded solemnly. "Then I'll treat you to dessert tonight. The best local delicacies in Backland are desserts. I know a place that's not expensive and tastes great," Lynn said with a smile. "Sounds good." Klein began to look forward to the late-night snack. The two then called for a horse-drawn carriage and discussed dessert topics on the way while waiting for the carriage to arrive at their destination. At almost the same time, in a nondescript house in Queens District. Under the cloak, Zio, Furs, and Audrey found a place to sit casually. Zio first inspected the items written on the blackboard, and breathed a sigh of relief after confirming the familiar content of Sequence 8 Sheriff's Potion Formula, £450. Regarding the final payment of £800 given by Audrey, Zio and Furs naturally chose to split it evenly. With the £400 obtained by Zio, what he was most concerned about was the Sheriff's Potion Formula, fearing that when Audrey came to attend the party, there would be no one selling the formula. Now that she confirmed that this tragedy hadn't happened, Zio naturally felt very happy. Ads by PubFuture. After being happy, Zio then looked around at the other people in the room, looking for familiar figures, and whispered to the two beside her. "That gentleman seems to be late. He won't be absent, right?" "He shouldn't be. He wrote in the letter that he would attend today's gathering. Maybe we arrived too early, and many people haven't come yet." The three whispered for a while, and they saw many people coming in one after another at the door. Finally, among these people, Zio saw a familiar figure. The other party was still in the same attire as last time, wearing a long robe with a hood and a black mask. So even though his face couldn't be seen, Zio still recognized him at a glance. "He's here." Zio pulled the two beside her and signaled to them. Furs and Audrey also looked in the direction of Lynn and Klein, the two newcomers. Zio simply confirmed if the person had arrived, while Audrey instinctively entered observer mode, starting to observe. "Male, not very old, seems to have a lively personality, suspected to have a hobby of drawing. He's greeting me, it seems that he's quite an outgoing gentleman. Male, not very old either, his body movements are very restrained, seems to be a reserved gentleman." Audrey's gaze fell on Lynn and Klein one after another, making preliminary judgments in her mind. On the other hand, Lynn and Klein, who had just walked into the room, naturally felt the gaze from Zio and the others. Knowing that one of the three was a telepathist, Klein, who had already known this, tried his best to use the abilities of a clown to control his expressions and body language, ensuring that he wouldn't reveal any flaws during the upcoming communication. Lynn then directly looked in the direction of the gaze and waved to the trio, but instead of bringing Klein over to them, he found another place to sit down with him. After sitting down, Lynn whispered as if he had discovered a great secret, that Miss Who wants to buy the Spectator Pathway formula is probably a young lady from a very wealthy noble family. End of chapter. How did you know? Klein looked at Lynn in astonishment. While he himself had some guesses about Justice Audrey's identity, it seemed odd for Lynn to know upon their first meeting. She's wearing the latest creation by Master Carlos on her head to cover her face. To deal with the elite of society, I've learned a bit about these things. People who can casually wear such a hat to Beander gatherings are rare, even among the nobility, Lynn explained quietly. His words weren't just speculation, they were based on the original owner's memories. "And I saw her ring too. The quality indicates it's worth at least £1,000, if not more, Lynn added, estimating conservatively. Klein's bank balance. Only a few £1,000s. Is this what the world of the wealthy is like? Despite feeling a bit overwhelmed by Justice Audrey's wealth, Klein wasn't overly surprised. Instead, he joked, isn't that a good thing? It means she can really afford to buy your formula. I think so too, Lynn nodded. He then glanced at the other people in the room, surveying the familiar and unfamiliar figures. Mr. A sat quietly and alone on the front sofa, observing everyone from a superior position. This reminded Lynn of something he had almost forgotten in the busy days. The case of Lenevis the swindler still needed resolution. This was also part of Klein's initiation gift. Lynn glanced at Klein, who hadn't noticed yet, then quickly looked away, pondering. Lenevis had to be dealt with, but since he was already heading towards becoming a true creator, Lynn couldn't handle it alone. It would be best to report it to the Evernight Church. But how to report it? How did he discover Lenevis's whereabouts and his suspected connection to the Divine Descendants container? This needed consideration. For example, what if it was a certain angel being sought by the Evernight Church who informed me of this? Lynn instantly had a follow-up plan in mind, though his thoughts inevitably drifted to another matter. Speaking of the true creator, Lynn pursed his lips, recalling his guardian, with a momentary darkness crossing his eyes. If his alterations to the past could really synchronize with the future, could he change Saucerier's fate? And what about a certain red angel crouching in an underground structure? Lynn rubbed his chin, unable to help but ponder this question. Before, he thought considering these matters was premature, but with his improving relationships with Saucerier and Medici, Lynn felt it was worth contemplating in advance. Perhaps I really should go see Little Red. Only through the parties involved can I clearly understand the impact of my actions in the past on the present. Lynn muttered to himself, then smiled brightly as he remembered something. And at this stage, Little Red probably can't beat me in my overpowered state. Well, it's time for Big Brother Lynn to show some love to the adult version of Little Red. Mr. A naturally had no idea that his small gathering actually had a deity like Lynn present. He continued to host the event according to the established procedure. Soon, it was time for trading. Lynn and Klein followed the waiter to a private room where they met the waiting Furs, Zio, and Audrey. Hello, are you the lady who wants to purchase the Spectator Pathway Potion formula? Lynn greeted proactively. You can call me Peeker. Hello, Mr. Peeker. You can also call me Audience. I am indeed the one who wants to buy the Spectator Pathway Potion formula, Audrey Hall responded with a perfect smile, while further assessing the two in front of her. Ads by PubFuture. From their actions, it seemed they were good friends. One had a lively personality, while the other was relatively reserved. Neither showed any malice, so they should be trustworthy. I can give you the Spectator, Telepathist, and Psychiatrist potion formulas now for the same price as last time, £1570, Lynn said calmly, pretending not to notice Audrey's scrutiny. He continued, as for the Hypnotist and Dreamwalker formulas, I should be able to get them within the year. If you need them, you can contact me through the contact information I provided you before. No problem, Audrey replied, withdrawing her gaze. She didn't think £1,000 or £2 was a big deal. She then took out an envelope and pushed it towards Lynn while saying, if possible, I'd like to get the remaining formulas as soon as possible. Instead of directly taking the envelope, Lynn also took out one and handed it to Audrey. After exchanging envelopes, they each opened theirs to check the contents. Audrey's envelope contained gold pounds, totaling £1,600, £30 more than Lynn's proposed price. Lynn's envelope contained 3 potion formulas prepared in advance. Audrey resisted the temptation to skip directly to the Psychiatrist formula, instead patiently examining them one by one. After confirming that the first 2 formulas matched what she knew, Audrey read the Psychiatrist potion formula as well. As she made mental notes, she couldn't help but smile satisfactorily and said, I'm very satisfied with this transaction. Thank you, Mr. Peeker. I am equally grateful for your generosity, Miss Audience, Lynn replied, neatly storing away the pounds in his hand. He continued, I wonder if you're interested in making some other transactions with me. What kind of transactions? Audrey asked with some curiosity. Miss Audience, You must be new to the Beander field. I wonder if you are interested in purchasing some knowledge about the mysticism from me, or perhaps some scrolls that record Beander abilities." Lynn smiled as he pitched. He brought up this topic not only to earn some extra money but also to naturally segue into the topic of the fool's name. Miss Audience seems quite confident in Mr. Peaker. Well, it makes sense. Someone who can produce so many potion formulas must indeed have a deep understanding of the mysterious domain. Audrey assessed Lynn while also becoming interested. Even though she had access to the Tarot Club, Audrey's curiosity about the Beander world made her open to learning more about the mysticism. Any knowledge that could be obtained with money was nothing to Audrey. So Audrey promptly asked, "Can you tell me what knowledge about the mysterious domain you have? And what scrolls do you have?" End of chapter. What kind of transactions? Audrey asked with some curiosity. Miss Audience, it depends on what knowledge you need in those areas. Facing Audrey Hall's inquiry, Lynn displayed a confident smile and calmly introduced, for example, understanding the characteristics of low-level paths like witches and secret worshippers, which tend to lean towards corruption and evil, can help you better protect yourself. Also, knowledge related to the spirit world, various extraordinary creatures, some buried history, and even. Lynn paused for a moment, as if hesitating, before continuing, regarding numerous hidden entities in mysticism, those mysterious or evil beings, and various secretive organizations within the Beander domain, I also have a considerable understanding. Although Miss Audience may not join those organizations or worship those entities, having more knowledge for self-defense is still a good choice. That sounds intriguing. Audrey's eyes lit up even brighter than before, clearly interested in what Lynn described. Mr. Peaker, do you really have a deep understanding of hidden entities in mysticism? Zio suddenly interjected. Basically, I have a general understanding of the hidden entities in mysticism, but the depth varies, Lynn replied with a smile, glancing at Zio. However, he saw a potential client and naturally inquired, "How about you? Are you interested in this knowledge?" Not exactly interested. Zio scratched her head, not sure how to explain. She couldn't exactly say that she recklessly uttered a certain hidden entity's true name and might have attracted its attention. That would sound too foolish. After struggling for a while, Zio could only say, "Mr. Peaker, have you heard of an existence called the Fool?" Upon hearing this, Audrey Hall almost choked, but fortunately, she was a mature spectator, and in the end, she restrained her expression, still wearing a smile without showing any difference. However, Audrey then glanced at Klein opposite her with a slight sense of confusion. As a mind reader, she observed that when Zio mentioned the name, Fool, the gentleman opposite her seemed to have a significant emotional fluctuation. Although he quickly restrained himself, Audrey caught it, sparking her curiosity almost instantly, and various speculations emerged in her mind. Could Mr. Peaker's companion also know Mr. Fool? No, if he only knew, his emotional fluctuations wouldn't be so significant. Could this gentleman have experienced something related to Mr. Fool, or even, be a follower of Mr. Fool? Audrey Hall speculated enthusiastically. As the most devoted believer in Mr. Fool in the Tarot Club, Audrey Hall never doubted the existence of many followers of Mr. Fool in this world. At this moment, she also began to speculate in this direction. On the other side of Audrey, Klein, who had barely controlled his expression and body movements with the help of the clown's ability, felt complex and uncomfortable at this moment. He knew that just now, due to his astonishment caused by being surprised, there might have been emotional fluctuations that Miss Justice could have captured. But even if Miss Justice noticed my relationship with Mr. Fool, it doesn't matter. After all, I can be a follower of Mr. Fool. Klein thought to himself, and then heard Lynn repeat with a slightly puzzled tone. Fool, ads by PubFuture. Naturally, Lynn had noticed the changes in both people's emotions. Having prepared himself psychologically and even subliminally suggested, he perfectly controlled himself, even momentarily showing a puzzled expression. Lynn then looked at Zio and asked, "I have never heard of an existence called Fool in the mysterious domain, but it's possible that the name I know is different from what you know. Do you have more detailed information about this Fool, such as his honored name? Maybe I can identify which entity this is from his honored name." There was a hint of curiosity in his tone. Upon hearing Lynn's words, Klein could almost guess the subsequent development. This made him feel embarrassed from the bottom of his heart, as if his behaviors after drinking had been recounted by a friend, and he almost wanted to dig out 2 layers of villas on the spot. Fortunately, after the astonishment just now, Klein had calmed down his emotions again, and he could barely control himself with the clown's ability, appearing calm and introverted as usual. The theatricality in the room at this moment was almost excessive, except for Furs and her little friend Zio. Yes, Zio nodded, then hesitated, finally thought of the fact that she had recited even the Tirani von Helmasuen's manuscript of the Old Hermes language, and decided to re-narrate it in Loan language. But before she could speak, Lynn interrupted her. While handing Zio paper and pen from his pocket, Lynn smiled and said, "Just write it in Loan language." Although theoretically, speaking out the honored name of hidden entities in normal languages may not have an effect, for the names of such high-level entities, it's safer to write them down, isn't it? Not every language can pronounce the honored names of gods to pray effectively. Generally, only languages such as Hermes, Old Hermes, Giant, Elven, and others that have communication with mysterious powers can establish a connection between believers and gods. Common languages like Loan are usually ineffective even if the name of an evil god is pronounced. Of course, if you are particularly unlucky and attract the attention of the gods, that's another matter. But there is no problem if it is copied down in a normal language. Official Beyonders usually do it this way. Otherwise, every time a new evil god is recorded, there would be a doomed official Beyonder. He is being very cautious, not as easygoing as usual, Klein muttered in his heart, somewhat surprised but not too amazed. After all, someone like Lynn who possesses extensive knowledge and hidden secrets may appear easygoing on the surface, but in the areas where caution is necessary, he is indeed very cautious. Otherwise, he wouldn't carry so many scrolls even though he thought the ambassador incident was over. End of chapter. Klein thought again about Lynn's generous spending, glancing once more at Lynn, who appeared reliable and mysterious at the moment. He felt like he understood this detective a bit more. "Thank you." Zio hastily took the paper and pen, scribbled a few lines of words on the paper, and then handed the pen and the paper with the honored name back to Lynn. "Let me see, is this the honored name of that mysterious existence?" Lynn pretended to look carefully, and on the blank paper was the honored name he was familiar with. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Ah, finally got the honored name of Mr. Fool." A hint of a smile appeared on Lynn's face, but his expression remained serious and cautious. He looked at the honored name on the paper with a pensive expression, as if trying hard to recall, but soon he looked puzzled. "How about it? Do you have any understanding of this mysterious existence?" Zio couldn't wait to ask after Lynn finished reading the honored name. "Sorry, I've never heard of such an existence before. But if it's important to you, I can try to find out more later. Consider it a personal favor, no need to pay me." Lynn shook his head, then hesitated, as if debating whether to say something. This hesitation naturally fell into Audrey's eyes. She sensed a complexity in Lynn's emotions, not disdain but something more intricate. Klein immediately perked up. He understood that when Lynn mentioned a strange person, he was likely referring to that angelic fellow countryman. "It's not exactly a strange person, but more like someone who saved my life." Lynn scratched his head, his expression complicated. "But he is indeed quite strange, always saying things I can't understand, and his behavior is very unusual. How should I put it? He's very, very eccentric. If he didn't trick me into believing in some strange existence, I might have thought he was a follower of some evil god. But it sounds like Mr. Peaker doesn't dislike him." Audrey Hall spoke up, curious about the strange person Lynn mentioned. She could tell that Mr. Peaker across from her seemed to have a complex emotion towards the person he spoke of. Ads by PubFuture. "After all, he saved my life," Lynn said, completely immersed in the role he played, almost convincing himself. He smiled and continued, "He once mentioned something about not belonging to this era, but I think it might be unrelated to this fool. Perhaps it's just a coincidence. Although it sounds like Mr. Peaker doesn't dislike him, huh?" Audrey Hall couldn't help but feel a bit dissatisfied. But she also knew that this was the normal attitude people had towards hidden existences. After all, not every hidden existence was as benevolent as Mr. Fool. While muttering in her heart, Audrey Hall didn't forget to comfort Zio. Don't worry, everything will be fine. As the Mr. Peaker said, some people can live to old age peacefully. Lynn seems to think the other person is doomed for sure. Indeed, it's common knowledge not to casually utter the honored name of a Beyonders, otherwise, I wouldn't have been so bold to conduct the ritual. Klein muttered in his heart, reflecting on his reckless behavior. Klein also considered another possibility, whether it would be better to keep Zio away from the Tarot Club, considering her fear after this incident. Maybe avoiding contact would be the best choice. Klein suddenly thought of this possibility, feeling a bit hesitant. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavy. After about half a minute, Lynn cleared his throat lightly and looked at Audrey. Let's go back to our previous topic, Miss Audience. Are you interested in purchasing the knowledge and scrolls one mentioned? Lynn asked, trying to change the subject. I can assure you, the prices I offer are fair, and you'll find them worth your while, whether it's knowledge or scrolls. End of chapter. Upon hearing Lynn's words, Audrey naturally shifted the topic, saying, I'm very interested. These are the items I prepared in advance. The prices for the corresponding knowledge are listed, as well as the prices for the scrolls. Lynn took out several folded sheets of paper and a pen from his pocket and handed them to Audrey, saying, take a look. If you need anything, just tick it off. Some knowledge I can provide on the spot, while others may have to wait until our next meeting. Of course, you can also give me an address, and I can mail the books to you. As for the scrolls, I didn't bring them with me. You can pre-order the ones you're interested in. My personal recommendation is to buy a few to try first. If you find them suitable, perhaps we can establish a long-term cooperation. I can guarantee that you won't find scrolls at this price elsewhere, and the variety won't be as extensive as what I have. Audrey eagerly accepted the papers and opened them to see the following contents. Assassin Pathway, Criminal Pathway, Other Pathways, Extraordinary Characteristics and Precautions, including detailed introductions to medium and low-level extraordinary abilities, as well as response methods in unfortunate situations, £300. Spirit Realm Travelogue, £500. Characteristics of secret organizations like the Aurora Order, Numinous Episcopate, Rose School of Thoughts, etc., branch ranges, and member introductions including detailed introductions to some members, £500. From top to bottom, most of the content consisted of various knowledge items, with a small part being the names of scrolls and brief descriptions of their abilities, along with their prices. Naturally, the prices of the scrolls were not as high as the knowledge, but the advantage lay in their repeatability, emphasizing a steady stream of income. Audrey looked through them, becoming more and more excited. Finally, she looked at Lynn, cleared her throat, and smiled gracefully, saying, very fair prices. So, Miss Audience, which ones are you interested in? Lynn smiled and asked. If possible, I'd like to purchase all the content, including the scrolls. Just give me one of each. Audrey smiled gracefully. She had just calculated the prices of all the knowledge, which amounted to approximately £3,000, not a small sum, but still within her affordable range. With Audrey's words, the room fell silent again, but the atmosphere was completely different from the previous silence. Furs and Zio both looked at Audrey in surprise. Although they already knew Miss Audrey was very wealthy, they didn't expect her to be so extravagant. Klein also glanced sideways, almost considering whether to sell more high-end knowledge to Miss Audrey at future tarot meetings. After all, it seemed that she really had no shortage of money, and she was willing to learn about Beyonder Fields. Miss Audrey truly lived up to her reputation as the richest lady in the Tarot Club. It was indeed worth seeking her out for some extra income. As the party involved, even if Lynn didn't care much about money, his mood improved slightly at this moment. He smiled and said, the knowledge I can provide you with right now, I'll give you immediately. As for the rest, do you want to wait until our next meeting or should I mail them to you? Next meeting, please, Audrey smiled. No problem. Lynn nodded, smiling. As a generous return for Miss Audience, I'll give you some extra non-saleable items this time. Would you like to learn about a more high-end knowledge or receive some scrolls that I don't usually sell to the public? Dealing with such a wealthy lady, Lynn naturally had to show the appropriate attitude. Being generous when necessary was the key to long-term transactions. Thank you, Mr. Peaker. Audrey was pleasantly surprised to hear this. After thinking for a few seconds, she said, I'd like to learn about a more high-end knowledge, please. Lynn wasn't surprised by this answer. He then took out a piece of paper and a pen from his pocket, wrote down a line, and handed it to Audrey. Thank you. Audrey Hall smiled and accepted the white paper, looking at it curiously. She saw the following content. Spectator Pathway. Sequence 1. Author. Ads by PubFuture. Author. The Sequence 1 of the Spectator Pathway is actually called Author. This is exactly what I wanted to know the most. Audrey was extremely surprised in this moment. Although it was just a simple sequence name, for Audrey, who was a Spectator Pathway herself, this name was more important than many other things. So, the first sequence of the Spectator Pathway was called Author. Could it be that the first sequence of the Spectator Pathway could write the fate of others like Author? Audrey couldn't help but imagine, while also looking at Lynn, saying, I'm very satisfied with this gift. If possible, I hope to learn more. Sorry, this part of the knowledge is still considered non-saleable for now. But maybe one day, when conditions allow, I'll be able to sell them to you. Lynn smiled and made a promise that couldn't be fulfilled for the time being. I hope that day will come soon. Audrey was somewhat disappointed, but she could tell that Mr. Peaker seemed genuinely reluctant to sell this knowledge, so she could only give up. The two sides then completed the transaction. After leaving the dark room, Lynn purchased the remaining extraordinary materials that the Melee Scholar potion was lacking from someone else, as well as a large number of spiritual materials. Mr. A's gathering also ended under such circumstances. Sitting in the carriage on the way back, Lynn sorted through the spiritual materials he had obtained. Just as he sealed everything with a spiritual veil, he saw Klein next to him hesitate to speak and smiled, asking, What's wrong, Sherlock? Something on your mind? Actually, it was intentional for Klein to show a hesitant expression. He pretended not to see Lynn's guilty look and asked with curiosity, just curious about that strange person you mentioned at the gathering. He sounds quite peculiar. Klein was not worried that such a direct question would arouse suspicion, as it was normal for anyone to be curious after hearing Lynn's description of the angelic compatriot. And finally, after waiting so long for such an opportunity to ask openly, Klein naturally wouldn't let it slip away easily. It's normal for you to be curious. Lynn glanced at Klein intentionally, as if it was not surprising that Klein would ask this. He just said, he is indeed a peculiar fellow. Otherwise, I wouldn't call him a strange person. Lynn rubbed his chin, seemingly lost in memories. But actually, I don't know much about him. I've only seen him a few times and listened to him ramble on about a bunch of strange things. At this point, Lynn seemed to remember something and glanced guiltily at Klein, quickly averting his gaze. Klein naturally understood why Lynn felt guilty. Pretending not to see this, he continued to ask, What did he say to you? End of this chapter.